Tonight I will be narrating 4 stories. 3 of them have to do with the wilderness, but story 1 will pull at your heartstrings. Literally. These stories were recorded on last night's live stream, so for those of you that made it to that, thank you. I hope you enjoy the edited, less mistaked versions just as much. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share their stories. Remember, you can send stories to rylhstories@gmail.com. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Being a single father, and late, is an unfortunately powerful recipe if you're looking to whip up some quick mishaps. My phone slipped from the dresser, and for whatever reason, managed to turn itself on. So when the rays of sun peeking through the window landed on my eyelids and woke me up, I was in a bit of a hurry. I yelled across the hall trying to wake Bethany up for school, and gathered my clothing and started the shower. Quickly running over to her room, I shook her awake, and pleaded her to get ready before we were both late. She shot a quick scowl before twisting around under the covers and mumbling something resembling compliance. Ever since my wife passed, it has been hard to keep up with everything. When I and she discovered we couldn't have children, we went with adoption. Unfortunately, during what was a lengthy process, my wife was struck by a car. When we met Bethany at the agency, she was so excited to have a new home, and my wife couldn't stop talking about it. I knew it would be hard, but even after her passing, I decided I would still go through with the adoption. It's what she would have wanted. Being a single parent to a child that is still somewhat of a stranger is challenging to say the least. Bethany isn't a bad kid, she's just distant, and sometimes it's like my words don't reach her. Through the warm water of the shower pelting my face, I could hear the faint shufflings of Bethany moving around the house. Relieved that we might just make it in time, after all, I shut the shower off and threw all my things together. Bethany was pulling her school books off the table, and I reached to get my work binders, and that's where the mix-up must have happened. Neither of us noticed. It wasn't until I had finally settled down at my desk, after dropping her off at school, did I realize it. Without looking, I pulled what I thought was my work notebook from my binder, and pried it open. Looking down at the white pages, I quickly discovered that what I had taken wasn't my notebook, it was Bethany's. Honestly, it wasn't my intention to peek at her thoughts. I knew that we needed boundaries, if we were going to grow together. It was hard to act like I didn't see it immediately though, and once I did, I couldn't take my eyes off it. On the second page wasn't her thoughts or aspirations. It was a cluttered list of names. Curious, I pulled the other page over, and saw that the list continued, and it would do so for another 10 pages, before the last page was only half full. On the last page, however, was a grouping of names that I recognized. In particular, was another girl from Bethany's school. As she mentioned a few times around the house, Bethany would say how much she disliked the girl. Under the girl's name, I saw 2 others with the same last name. My fingers tapped neurotically against the name, as I considered what the list of names could be, and what to do about it. I figured maybe I would contact the parents, and see if they knew of any issues between our 2 daughters. Daughter, that's still so weird to say. Or, right, I suppose. I had expected Bethany to bring that up, that I had taken her notebook, but instead, I was able to slip it among her belongings when she got home. The next morning wasn't as hectic as my phone's alarm rang out to wake me up on time. Bethany had school, but I was off from work, so I drove her to school, and made sure she got in safe. Fortunately, I knew the parents listed in the notebook already. You make a lot of connections in my line of work. They were only a few minutes away from the school, and their daughter took the bus, so I figured at least one of them would be home. I had expected that the girl was bullying my daughter, but as it turned out, it was the other way around. The parents, who were all but burning holes in my chest, went on about how Bethany would push their daughter around and poke her with pencils. Whenever the girl would tell someone at school about Bethany, nothing would come of it. I assured them that I didn't know about any of it, and that I would have a talk with Bethany. Even through their rage, they tried to be understanding. They knew about my situation. I made a few calls to the school, and talked to whoever they would let me talk to. I didn't want to bring it up to Bethany, and accuse her of something she didn't do. I also called the adoption agency, to see if there was a history of violent behavior. Both calls yielded the same result. Both informed me that she would be aggressive towards others. Neither the school nor the agency could explain what caused the issue. It was like Bethany would just choose a mark and try to hurt them, so I practiced what I would say to her. How I would try to be her dad without coming on too strong and scaring her. The drive home was pretty quiet. I didn't want to bring it up in the car, as I wanted the environment to be as comfortable as possible. We walked into the house, and as Bethany sat her things down, I asked her if we could talk. Her face dropped slightly, and I guessed that she had noticed that I had seen her notebook after all. Those small fingers clutching the straps of her backpack almost offensively. With a soft tone, I told her that I wasn't trying to make her feel bad, that I knew she was having issues in school, and if I could help her in any way. I planned to leave it open, and not directly accuse her of anything. Give her enough room to explain it, how she wanted to, and then I'd sort out the details. She stood in the living room biting her teeth for a few moments of silence. Just as I began to think she was shutting me out, she spoke. Bethany told me that I wouldn't believe her, that no one ever does. I gave her my friendliest smile, and told her that we need to be able to open up to each other, and that I would listen to anything she had to say. Her fingers gripped the backpack even harder, and her eye contact with me became sparse. Swinging the backpack around, she unzipped it, and pulled the notebook out. Walking over to the table, she set it down and opened it. She turned her head like she was beckoning me over, so I followed her, and looked down at the paper. No one else can see them, she said with her finger placed on the name of her classmate. Looking at the paper, I noticed that a few more names had been written down. I told her that I went to see the girl's parents, that I didn't understand what she meant, that I could see them. Not like I do, she replied. Her fingers pushed under the page and lifted it. She turned the page a few more times. With each page turn, I could see a faint outline becoming bolder. A lump in my throat caught as she approached whatever the black mass was. When Bethany reached the page with the drawing, she stopped and shot me a hesitant glance. I could only see her nervous expression out of the corner of my eye. It was hard to take my eyes off the drawing. I recognized the person she had depicted on the page. It was the woman that had helped me, and my wife at the adoption agency. Turning the pages of the notebook back, I looked through the earlier list of names, until I found hers, and then turned back to the drawing. It was of the woman, but she had thin black lines running off of her. The lines went upwards, until hitting the edge of the page. I looked at Bethany. She could see the confusion painted on my face. Then she turned the page again. On the newly turned page was another figure. Judging by the small circle she had drawn to represent the earth, the new figure was much larger. It looked like a human, but its features were sharp and unsettling. I could only gather so much in the child's drawing. It looked like an enormous doll was holding planks of wood that dripped strings onto the world. Slowly, I flipped from one page to the other, trying to take it all in. I could see Bethany the whole time. She wasn't proud to show me her drawings, or excited to see what I'd think. She was pulling back, already afraid of me admonishing her. I stared at the large, human-like figure moving the people with strings stuck to them. If Bethany did see these strings, maybe she was trying to find ways to free people from them, by pushing them off the strings, or poking at where they connect. Or maybe she's just a little girl struggling to connect and fabricating a narrative around her struggle. I couldn't handle the expression of her face anymore. I closed the book and flashed the same smile I had earlier. I believe you, I told her. I wasn't completely lying. I believe she thinks that's what's going on. She had me now though, and I could show her what a real family is like, and what real friends are like. It'll take a while, but over time, I can teach her how to connect. Her face relaxed. She wanted to smile. I could see that much. Bethany is a smart kid, and a pretty good artist. She would know there was doubt behind my words, but maybe someone at least trying to see it her way was enough. We went through our day, and I think we made a powerful step forward. Dinner was full of conversation, and it felt like everything was going to work out. It was my plan the next day to go over to the girl's parents once more, and try to explain the situation, and come up with a conclusion. I pulled up to the school, and watched Bethany open the door to get out, and she stopped. Quickly going through her backpack, she pulled the notebook out and handed it to me. "You take this one," she spoke softly. Reaching over, I pulled the notebook from her hands. She was going to school without it, and she trusted me with it. Something I had seen her protecting like it held the secrets to the world. She trusted me. Wonder if she saw me fighting back the tears. I couldn't help but think how proud my wife would have been. Have a good day at school, I replied, putting the notebook on my lap. When she left the car and made it into the school, I opened the notebook again. Turning to the drawings, I stared at them, illuminated by harsh sunlight. The lines of the creature with his hands almost clutching the earth. I thought they were scribbles initially. Looking at it closer, each bit of it was purposeful though. It was made of the very same strings that connected to the agency woman on the page before. I could feel myself getting sucked into drawing. Like a good book, the narrative was tugging away at my suspension of belief. Shutting the book, I allowed myself to take a deep breath and bring myself back to reality. A few short minutes later, I was once again at the door of the parents I had spoken to previously. And rapping my knuckles on their door, the father pulled the door open, and I stood on the porch explaining everything that I discovered. It all went better than I thought it would, and Bethany was even invited to his daughter's birthday party. That being said, I don't think we're going to go. The whole time we were talking, I couldn't help but think of his name written in pencil on that list. I couldn't help but think about the strings coming off of that woman in the drawing, that Bethany would have seen them above him. When he turned away to walk back inside, I watched him. I watched the folds on his shirt shifting around. I could see a fold on his shirt that acted on its own, like someone was tugging it. Something I would never have noticed if I wasn't looking for it. And in the brief time I observed it, I began to notice a thick, black line reaching upwards. Even with the door closed, I kept my eyes on where I thought he might still be, as I slowly and carefully backed away from the house. Each step off the porch revealing more and more in my line of sight, until I was far enough away I could see the whole house. A collection of bold, dark lines blocked the blue sky, like telephone wires. They rose into the sky, until disappearing beyond my perception. They weren't the only ones though. As I turned around to observe the neighborhood, the same inky lines were running up from various houses. Not every house had them, and some only had a few, but the lines painted the skyline. I watched in awe as the wires moved around, as a man would exit his house, and the wires would conduct him into his car. Keeping my eyes on the road as I drove, to wait for Bethany was difficult. Someone a few cars ahead of me had wires lifting from the roof of their car. As I sat and waited in the parking lot, I pulled out the notebook again. I looked at some of the others, waiting for their children to be released. I recognized some of them, even with the distracting lines coming off of them. With pen in hand, I scribbled their names down one after the other. You know a lot of names in my line of work. Through the sheets of paper, that mass of black that Bethany had drawn was always calling to me. My mind wandered to the things she had drawn around the world. When I looked up at the blue sky, I could tell there was something beyond it. Something dark was tainting the once perfectly blue overhead. A group of wires running towards the darkness like lines of the road, trying to lead me into its grasp. I must have zoned out looking into the sky, trying to see what Bethany had drawn. I didn't even notice her get into the car and sit beside me. You see them? Her quaint voice broke the daze I was in and pulled my attention. Replying that I did, she smiled. Not only did I believe her, but she finally had someone to connect with. So what do we do? I asked her, looking for advice from a child. She held a long, thoughtful gaze before telling me that we'd have to figure that out together. She's very smart for her age. I guess she would have to be. Truth is, I don't know what to do moving forward. I can't take my eyes off them. All the strings in my office, on the drive to work, they're everywhere. My wife used to knit. She would always keep a pair of scissors with her in her kit, in case we were out and she wanted to work on something. She used to always joke that those scissors could cut through anything. They're right next to me as I type, their shining metal reflecting the moonlight. Should we even do something? If we could cut those wires, what would that mean? Every day, I'm able to see that thing in the sky clearer. The more I see of those wires, the more its figure is revealed. It seems like people who don't have the wires the day before would have them the next time I see them. Was I just unable to see them? Or were they just attached? Do we all have these wires? If not, what happens when we do? I think I have to try something. So I'm writing this all down. Bethany tried to do as much as she could without bringing too much attention to herself or getting in trouble. I don't have restrictions like that. I can do more. I'm going to see what happens when you cut those strings. After putting up my post last night, detailing how my daughter's journal led me to discover people with strings coming out of them, I spent a long time just sitting at my desk with my chin resting on my open palm. Bethany had long since been put to bed, and I just sat in the darkness, staring at the bleak shadows of my room. My left hand continued to tap the smooth and silver metal of my wife's scissors. I could feel their chill each time my finger made contact. I thought about what my wife would have done in a situation like this. I wondered if I was just going crazy due to her passing. Maybe I was looking for an escape too, and bought into Bethany's fantasy. If that were the case though, I would have nothing to lose by trying to cut the strings coming out of people. I would look weird for a moment is all. It wasn't until I heard a car starting up that I was shaken from my trance. Looking at the clock, I had noticed it had already become 3, which meant several hours had slipped away from me. Getting up, I got up and felt the dizzying effects of my statue-like state. Once my head was straight, I walked over to the window. There was a set of headlights piercing the darkness a few houses down. A gentle rumbling of the motor, and the exhaust spilling out light gray smoke, stuck out from within the night. The headlights bounced off a garage door and landed on a set of wires that were jutting out from the car's roof. I could tell the driver was alone by the number of wires. Without knowing it, I had carried the scissors over to the window with me, and was clutching the metal hard enough to dig into my own skin. It's hard to explain, but watching that car idling in the driveway was like a beacon. The driver was all alone. Making my way through the house as silently as I could, I got my keys, a heavy jacket, and a scarf to cover my face. There was no plan. Even as I started my car up in the dead of night, I didn't know what to do. Making sure to keep my headlights off, I slowly pulled out of my driveway and began to follow the other car. We drove straight for a good while. Eventually, I turned my headlights on. After a few red lights, I thought there's no way the man didn't see me. Several times I thought about just turning around and forgetting about it, but the streets seemed to be so empty, like fate had orchestrated it to be just me and him on the road. As we passed by residential areas and business, I could see the wires lifting into the sky like hundreds of pillars trying to hold up the night. Another few intersections passed us by until the man in front of me turned down into an alleyway off a side street. Normally I would have been too nervous to follow him into somewhere so narrow, but my curiosity was guiding me the same way his strings pulled him along. When I pulled around the corner into the alley, I noticed the red hue of his brake lights, partially blocked by his figure. He was standing in front of his open trunk. I was already trying to think of excuses for why I was following him as I stepped out of my car. That's when I saw another wire on his person. This one was small and black like the others, but they ran from the headphones on his head to his pocket. It all seemed too perfect. I should have realized there was no way he didn't know someone was tailing him. No way he didn't see my headlights follow him into an alley. All the same, I tiptoed as lightly as I could until I was close enough to reach out. Perhaps my boldness stemmed from knowing I had no intention to hurt the man. Someone I know now that I had never seen before. All I had to do was reach out and bring the handles of her scissors together around one of those wires. So that's what I did. Watching the wires tugging at his clothing very carefully, I reached a pair of scissors over his left arm, with the blades on either side of the thick, black line. I quickly brought my fingers together and snipped the cord. To my surprise, there was no resistance. So little feeling associated his snipping the man's wire, that I initially assumed it just didn't work. That wasn't until I heard the thud. The wire I was keeping my eye on seemed to zip off into the sky when I cut it, like a cosmic being slurped up pasta. I stepped back as the man straightened his posture. It felt like my ability to control my body had been stripped away before. Not because of wires, but because I had never seen a severed arm in person. My eyes were stuck looking at it. His left arm laid still on the floor, severed perfectly where the wire had been cut by his shoulder. There wasn't any blood pouring out of some gaping wound. Even the shirt's fabric was cleanly cut. You would have thought it was a prosthetic arm. That wasn't the worst of it. What I had been assuming was just some neighbor I hadn't met yet started turning to face me. Slow and calm, like he wasn't put off in the slightest. With the benefit of my headlights, I was able to witness every detail as he faced me. From the splitting points where his arm used to be, I could see small hints of black protruding out and wriggling around. When I went to look him in the eyes, All I could see was the same wriggling black threads. Even within his toothy smile, the same wires that led into the night sky were pushing through his gums. "I see you too." Those words, spoken by the man, still echo through my head. The voice was a poor imitation of human speech. There was a noticeable metallic twinge behind him. It sounded as if the words were being produced by rubbing metal together. After hearing him speak, I quickly backed up and fumbled around trying to get back into my car. As I backed out of the alley, I watched as the man, still smiling, started to rise into the air. The strings that pulled him upwards were vibrating as they did so. A thread reached down and picked up the arm that had fallen off as well. The drive home felt like it took much longer than it did getting to the alley, every black line along the way sticking out more. It felt like the strings were trying to get my attention, almost as if they wanted me to look at the sky. I refused. My daughter's drawing still burned into the back of my mind. Getting home, I repeated my silent escape in reverse, and retreated to my room after making sure Bethany was safe and sound. There was no way I would be able to sleep after what I had witnessed, so I decided to try and figure it out. It was while I sat there thinking that I decided to take a second look at the house the man left from. Fingers landing on the windowsill, I pulled open, letting the night's air in, and leaned out the window to get a better look at the house. I knew that house. I had worked with the owners recently to get better insurance on the very same home. Neither of them looked like that man. They were an old couple who didn't even own a car. I thought maybe the man was a relative, but I didn't remember seeing a car in the driveway on the way home. The further thoughts, I came to the conclusion that if the car starting up was enough to snap me out of my trance, why didn't he arriving catch my attention? It's not like he could have just fallen out of the sky, was the very thought swimming through my head when I figured it out. Leaving the house at 3, driving around town, and eventually pulling into an alley, paying no mind to me. I had to accept that I had very likely just been played. Even without threads tugging at me, I was played with like a puppet. It had scared me. That's what it wanted to do, I think. It's not that I hadn't noticed. I was just trying to ignore it. All the time I had been out driving, and even when I got home and looked out the window, there wasn't a single star in the sky. The thing had messed up though. In the alley, I discovered that I could in fact cut the cord. Some little girl with no understanding of what she was looking at, or how to handle it, was one thing, but it wouldn't want me snooping around, right? I assumed, somehow in my naivety, that I had gained the upper hand against some cosmic being. Sleep was starting to take over, even though I knew that these strings would attach to more people as time went on. My eyelids could not have been heavier. My last thoughts when falling asleep were ponderings on what would happen if those strings got all of us. When my eyes opened again, it was Bethany shaking me awake. She had found me slumped over at my desk, and was worried since I always wake her. I could hear her calling me by my first name. I don't know why, but I always assumed the title of Dad would have come more naturally, so hearing her echo my name is odd. I lifted from my stupor and gave her a smile. She informed me that we were late for school and work. She was filled with glee when I told her that neither of us had to go in today, until she noticed that dark circles under my eyes. Perceptive. Instead of recounting the entire story, I instead slid the scissors across the desk, resting my fingers on them. I told her how they belonged to my wife, the woman who was going to adopt her with me. I told her that my wife's scissors were able to cut the wires she's been seeing, that I was going to help her. We talked for a while about her. My wife, I mean. Bethany wanted to know all sorts of things, expressing more interest in the pretty lady and all the pictures around the house than all the strings obscuring the sky. It was nice to talk about her for a while, and get to share with Bethany like that, to connect. Once the talk had gone on long enough that Bethany had realized she was hungry, we walked downstairs and prepared something to eat. All the while, I was thinking of what to do next, if I should challenge that beast Bethany had drawn. With breakfast all said and done, I decided at the very least, one person couldn't hurt. I needed to know. I remembered the family I had talked to about Bethany's issues in school, how they had invited her to party, and decided I would head over there. That's where I first saw the wires after all. So before I knew it, my car was resting curbside by their house. Scissors stuffed in my pocket, I exited the car and walked up to their porch. I had called ahead of time, under the pretense of talking more. I told them I had to rush out last time for an emergency, before we could properly go over things. Part of me feels like they were just looking for more parent friends to connect with. The husband once again swung the door open and greeted me with a smile. I tried to return it while staring at the black lines above him. He turned around after inviting me in and started to lead the way into his house. Luckily, I was taller than him, so when he turned his back, I just went for it. The situation had presented itself, and I had to take it. Slipping the scissors from my pocket, I quickly swept the scissors above his head, like I was cutting construction paper. It was much easier to see the threads splitting apart in broad daylight. Like before, the threads I had cut was lifted away free of their host. Even the small bits hanging off his clothing seemed to turn into ash and drift off. He straightened his back and began turning to me. Flashbacks of the night before playing in my mind. "Did you feel that?" He asked me like a ghost had just walked through him. I replied that I didn't feel anything, and he scoffed. Felt light for a moment there. He was clearly out of sorts, but none of his body parts had fallen off, so I took it as a win. His mouth opened to speak again, but I couldn't hear anything. Moments after the cords were severed, a noise like a horn sounded out. It was so loud that I could feel it rattling the fabric of my clothing, but the man standing across from me didn't seem disturbed by it, or he couldn't even hear it. Along with the roar was the feeling of a breeze sweeping around me. I could tell where the noise was coming from. An intense roar emitted from the sky above me, like some wounded animal crying for help. As the man continued trying to talk, I saw his wife standing in the kitchen behind him. She was just standing there, staring right into my eyes, until her mouth moved. Even though her mouth was moving, the words she was saying was coming from above, hidden within the scream. "I see you too." Even focused on my own mounting fear, and the woman, I could see a perplexed expression forming on the man's face. His lips stopped moving, and the confusion painted more. As the roaring ceased, he spoke again. "What the hell are they doing?" I swiveled to see what he was referring to, and when I did, I saw a chorus of black threads leading people out of their houses. All of them standing on porches, or by the side of the road just staring right at me. A few of the closer ones started walking towards me, and I wasted no time sprinting to my car, ignoring those around me. As I desperately raced home, worried about Bethany, I caught occasional glimpses of the bright blue sky, and what was behind it. Two bright orbs, like the moon, hung space from each other, and I could see the vague imagery of a figure attached to them looming over the town. All the threads, as I drove home, led right to it. Pulling up to the house, I could already see a few people guided by the threads moving in my direction. Stumbling over myself, I rushed into the house and closed the door behind me, my fingers shaking as I struggled with the lock. I heard the wood floor creak behind me and gripped the scissors in my pocket. Quickly turning around, I saw Bethany. My tension escaped as a sigh, and I dropped to the floor. "There's a lot of wire people outside," she spoke. I could hear it quivering behind her words, the same that would have been behind mine if she didn't speak first. Gathering myself, I got up and brought her into her bedroom. Wanting to calm her nerves, I told her that if we make a fort, they couldn't get us. We worked together putting pillows on top of each other and throwing the sheets over the top to close it off. We climbed inside, and I made sure to tell her I'd protect her no matter what. We spent a long time in that fort, playing various games and coloring in her book. Anything I could come up with to distract her. I don't know how we played patty cake for nearly an hour, but we managed. Before long, the dark lines that stuck out so well on the blue backdrop became hidden against the night sky. I knew they were still here though, surrounding our house. Every time I got the courage to look outside, there was more of them, and I couldn't imagine a way out. Finally, there was a knock at the door. I and Bethany nearly screamed when we heard it. We were so focused on coloring in one of the characters, on some after-school program, that we had forgotten about the outside world. With a whisper, I told Bethany to stay in the fort no matter what. She tried to protest, but I showed her I had the scissors and guaranteed her I would be safe. Leaving the fort, I quietly paced my way to the stairs. The knocking would periodically sound out during my slow descent down the steps, placing both of my hands on the door ready to brace it if something tried to break it down. Whatever good that'd do. I looked through the peephole. On the other side was... it was my wife, looking just like she did the day she left, the day she got into her accident. With the porch light illuminating her like a halo, I could see her fair skin and rosy cheeks. I know she died. I know that, but it's her. She's out here right now knocking on the door. She's asking if she can come in. I know she's dead. I can see the wires, but it's her. Maybe I can be with her again. I couldn't possibly express how long I was standing at the other side of that door, my hand gently pressed against the wood, feeling the occasional vibration. Time could have bled into absolute nothing around me, and I'd still be there with my eye pressed against the peephole. It was her. There was no doubt in my mind that my wife, or some semblance of her, was standing on the other side of the door. Her smile showing the teeth that had been cracked during the car crash, and a scar running down her face, stitched with wire. Most importantly, I could see the faint glimmering of her wedding ring. Every so often I would feel my hand sliding across the door. Heading towards the doorknob, I would just accept it. I could see the strings that controlled her movements. I knew my wife was dead, and she wasn't coming back. But if I went to meet her by her design, then maybe that would be okay. Minutes could have passed, or hours could have swept me by, before eventually my hand did fall on the handle. All it would take was one turn, and the door would unlock. There would be nothing between me and her. The other wired people standing outside would be free to flood into the house, and I'd be with her. My fingers tightened around the door handle, and like I was being manipulated, I began to turn. "Daddy?" Her voice sounded like it was whispered and carried by the wind, drifting ever so gently into my ears. With one turn, I was face to face with her, staring into the eyes of my baby girl, her hands nervously cusped together. Bethany's eyes reflected the remaining moonlight so powerfully. I thought she'd light the whole room. My hands still on the door handle, I stared into Bethany's eyes. I echoed my own words in my head, about how I would trust her and protect her. How after moving from house to house, never knowing when she'd have to find a new family, that I would save her from that. Like it or not, we all have strings on us. Things that tie to us and pull us every which way, and sometimes it's hard to break free. Whether it's a job that makes you miserable, or it's an abusive relationship, we all have wires that pull us like puppets. Even something as hard as losing a loved one, or not having a consistent family. Looking at Bethany, I never saw strings, but they were there. But over time, I'll sever those too. I'll show her she doesn't need to fear connection. My ties were on the other side of the door. Ever since she'd passed, I'd been stuck, drifting from home to work like I was being tugged along. Even with Bethany, I had trouble feeling like I'd ever been free from that pain. But we don't need to be free of pain. We just need to stop letting it control us. I felt a softness I hadn't experienced in a long time, seeing Bethany standing there, worried she was about to lose me. With our eyes still locked, I twisted my hand and heard the firm click of the door unlocking. Then the door swung open. Standing firmly, I saw my wife, inches away from me with nothing between us. I saw the horde of wired puppets littering my lawn, watching just as Bethany was. My wife stepped forward, her movements slow and crooked. My desire to reach out and hold her, to embrace even just the memory burned hot. Another step forward. I could see the colors in her eye had faded since the last time I got lost in them. Another step forward. I was able to see the faint scuffs of dirt still clinging to her clothing, and the brown resting under chipped fingernails. Another step forward. The wood inside creaked under her weight. Her skin wasn't as pale as the first time I saw it. She was turning a sickly purple. She reached out her arms, gesturing for an embrace. I reached my arm out to her. One smooth movement swung over her head. Scissors in hand, I saw the wires split like a sword, slicing through the water. All the wires that had been cut zipped into the sky, and the same shriek as last time followed it. This time though, I could see the other wires. All the strings connected to the other people. All vibrated when the creature above cried out. It causes pain. The body of my wife dropped to the dirt, and her colors began to shift until her entire body took on a metallic black. It was difficult to watch something resembling the woman I loved, falling apart until she was just a bundle of strings. I didn't have much time to think. As the wired people started making their advance, quickly I went over everything in my head. After all was said and done, all the conclusions I brought myself to, all I knew is my daughter is something special. All the names in her notebook were people she knew. She had personal connections to, even if it was faint, or if the possibility of a connection was there. She would put these names in her journal, even going as far to draw her social worker, someone who would be the closest to her. When she told me about everything, I started to see the strings just like she did. And then the strings began to spread faster, because I had connections all over the city. I was looking at Bethany again. I could hear the others stepping inside the house behind me. What would they do if they caught me? Put wires on me too? Make sure I could never make my own decisions? Never leave Bethany? How alone can one girl get before she desires connection so bad? How desperate can one man be to see his wife again? There was no cosmic entity, no great force from another dimension manipulating the people in a small town. There was just me and Bethany. Our inability to cope with our fears of losing, terrified of change beyond our control. It was no wonder my wife's scissors could slice the threads above the people. I gave them the power to do so. Before the other wired individuals got close enough, I quickly stepped over to Bethany and knelt to her. She was worried I'd push her away if I discovered the strings she saw hanging over people's heads, so worried that I would send her back. Place yours on mine, I spoke, holding out my open palm. She hesitated at first, but eventually her small hand pressed against mine. The people behind me had stopped moving completely, or at least I couldn't hear them. I lifted my other hand and circled our touching hands. She looked at me curiously. I asked her if she could see the thread. She stared at me for a while as I continued wrapping our hands together. Her face lit up and she nodded her head. Help me tie it? She used her other, and together we tied the thin red string that I saw on my head around our hands. I smiled at her. She returned the expression. Now no matter what, we're tied together, okay? I questioned, hoping I was on the right track. Still beaming, she nodded her head. I heard the people behind me starting to stir again, creaking the wood as they moved. Anxious, I turned around to observe them walking. Only, they were leaving the house, and my heart became light. Standing up, still holding Bethany's hand, we walked to the front door and watched the citizens spreading out, the strings directing them home. Once all of them seemed far enough away, the strings that held them in chorus started lifting into the air. One after another, the people in town were being freed of their strings. Bethany had found her connection, something she can hold on to without forcing people to be with her. Well, I'll never get the knowledge that I don't get to be with my wife anymore. I have a light in my life again. A beaming little girl with a big heart and a dangerous imagination. As the night sky finally became vacant of those black lines I had come to know over the last few days, I couldn't help but think one thing. I'm not looking forward to when Bethany is a teenager. I want to preface this by saying, I know it sounds insane. You're probably thinking I was on something, but I promise, even after thinking it over for as long as I have, I don't think it was a hallucination. This is just, it really creeped me out, and I can't think of any explanation. I'm starting to feel like I'm running out of time. It was 2 weeks ago when I saw it. It was a Sunday, and the dog owner of a large and hyper German Shepherd, B, I make a point of taking extra long walks on this particular day. It tires her out just enough to keep her from barking throughout the night, and it gets me out of the house. I work from home most of the time, and it can get pretty suffocating sitting in one place for huge chunks of the day. I live close by to a bunch of mountain trails that have mostly been abandoned by the district council. It's out of the way of any major towns, even villages really. The closest thing being 15 or so minutes by car, so I guess they just sort of forgot they ever existed. The paths are overgrown and unruly, but it really isn't that bad once you get used to it. At night it can get pretty dark, but pack a torch and it's a beautiful place to live. B likes it anyway. Or liked, I guess. It was a good day. The sun was shining and the sky was mostly clear, but nothing to worry about. I take extra caution on cloudier days so that I don't get lost in the haze, but that day was just so clear that I can't still wrap my head around what I saw, or how I saw it. This is where I get extremely confused. I take the exact same path every time, So much so I can let my dog off her leash and let her run havoc along the trail. She's smart and knows them better than I do. So I can't understand how this had even happened, but I digress. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes. Bee's excitement about being outside slowing down to a curious trickle. She's never strayed far from me, but she was by no means a clingy dog. She was fiercely independent and brave. A cookie-cutter example of a German Shepherd, really. And I love that about her. It was just unfortunate that she decided today would be the day she strayed just a little bit too far out of my sight. We rounded a corner, the hills on either side of us rising up high and steep enough that I could only just see the top. It was my favorite part of this walk. I like to think it was an organic corridor, the mountains parting just a little bit to allow passers-by to go through. It always had a friendly, cozy feel to it. Magic. I'd never felt more wrong about anything. Bee raced around the corner, and I lost sight of her. I wasn't worried. She always stopped to wait when she sensed I wasn't keeping up, and there was nowhere else to go but forwards for another half a mile anyway, so she couldn't possibly get lost. Which is why my body froze up when I didn't see my dog. I guess I wasn't paying too much attention, or it happened so suddenly that I hadn't noticed. But I couldn't see the sky anymore, or the tops of the hills. Instead, a thick, white mist shrouded them. I thought maybe I just misread the weather, and it was beginning to get misty as it tends to do in the mountains. But after the fourth time calling Bee, with no sign of her, I was starting to worry. The fog got thicker around me and the farther I walked, and I felt sluggish, like it was trying to slow me down, but I persisted, calling Bee louder each time. I shivered. When did it get so cold? It was the middle of summer, and under my feet, I could feel the crunch of frost. The air was dry, despite the fog, and I found it hard to breathe. I was starting to panic. What was going on? I hit a wall, except there was nothing there. Just mist. I put my hand out, my fingers red and sore from the cold, but they would go no farther than a few inches in front of me. I could barely see my feet at this point, and the hills beside me had dissolved into nothing. It was like I'd stumbled into a loading screen, or the world hadn't been finished up until this point, or as though I'd walked into somewhere I shouldn't have. I stood there shivering for what felt like hours, my eyes hurting from the bright glare. There was no possible way there was a wall here. I'd walked this path every week for years, and it had always been clear. And if there was a wall, which was impossible, where was my dog? My voice cracked in the cold, and it hurt to speak, but I called out for Bee once more, though predictably, I was met with silence. When I say silence, I want to say it was a regular silence. I really want to believe it was, and maybe it was just my panic in the moment, but it was like my voice had been swallowed up by the air, ripped from my throat, and silenced the second it left my mouth. But then I heard something, a low, wet snap. I turned and ran. It's weird to say, but I felt like I was dissolving, like my body was slowly being chipped away. I felt hollow and heavy. My limbs simultaneously felt like lead weights, and like I didn't have anything there at all. I didn't exist for the few minutes I was there. Exhausted, I broke free into the sunshine, breathing heavy as the summer heat descended on my skin. I was out of the corridor now, the aged trail map greeting me. Down below me, I could see my house, still bathed in glittery sunlight. It didn't feel welcoming anymore. It's been 2 weeks since then, and I haven't gone back. Bee hasn't returned, and as much as it pains me to say, I don't think she ever will. What really bothers me the most right now is when I look through my back window to the mountains above. I can't see the trail map anymore, or the tops of the range, just thick, white fog. I think it's moving closer, and I think there's something in it. It was a cool, crisp August morning in 2017, and I thought it would be a good idea to take a few days off and go camping, which in hindsight was a bad idea. In my area of North California, the weather was to be stormy, but I just couldn't stay away. That morning I packed my bags and headed out. It took a few good hours to get to the spot that my grandfather had taken me to when I was younger. When I arrived, there was a slight breeze, and a hint of rain in the air. Nevertheless, I wouldn't let a little rain hold me back from what I loved doing. I grabbed my pack and my tent, locked my truck, and headed out into the woods. Before getting too far away from my truck, I checked my bag. I had brought enough food to last a few more days in the woods, checked if I had brought my medicine, and lastly, my gun, for bears of course. I never thought I would have to use it. I hoisted my bag onto my back and walked further. I had walked until I could barely see the outline of my truck. I wanted to be close enough to run to it in case anything happened, but far enough away for it to not bother me. I cleared a space for my tent and set it up. Side note, tents are a lot harder to set up with only one person. By the time I set up the tent, there was barely any light in the sky. Not enough for it to be pitch black, but just enough for me to see what I was doing. I gathered up what dry sticks and twigs I could find and set up a fire, which I set up in record time, if I say so myself. I cooked the food I had brought with me for the night, and when I was done, I walked into the woods until I could barely see the light of the fire, and threw the scraps as far away as I could. As I was walking back, I could tell that the woods became a little more quiet than they were earlier. I shook that out of my mind and walked back. When I got back, I packed all of the food into an extra bag I had brought with, and tied it high into a tree, then went back to my spot by the fire. I opened my pack and went looking for my medicine, which was a decent-sized bag of weed and a bottle of Jack Daniels. Dessert, I thought to myself. I grabbed the phone I had in my bag, put in some headphones, put on some music, and medicated with old videos. I started to feel little raindrops hit me, so I unzipped the tent and went in. I slept for about an hour. When I was awoken to the sound of thunder, I cursed under my breath as rain fell heavily onto my tent. I unzipped the tent to take a piss. Then I stopped. I had heard something rustle off into the woods behind my tent. It sounded very close. Still, I thought it was a deer or something. I put on my jacket and went off. While I was pissing, I could hear what sounded like crying. I finished up and looked around. I had my back to the tree. I heard "help" whispered into my ear. I whipped around and saw nothing, when just as I had heard thunder blast off in the distance. I slowly walked toward my tent, got in, and slowly zipped it up, all while grabbing the gun I had brought with me. And there I sat for what felt like hours, when I heard fast scraping against my tent, like something had run past. I yelped like a kid afraid of the dark. I then mustered up the courage to yell, "Hey, get out of here! I'm armed, and I'm not in the mood." This only got me the response of another scrape across the front of my tent. I pulled the slide back on my gun and yelled out, "Last chance, I will shoot you." This seemed to get the response I hadn't thought of. By the time the last word came out of my mouth, the back of my tent was cut open, and water came pouring in, soaking everything in the tent. This got me to turn where the slash had come from and fire. The woods went quiet as I unzipped the tent and went out next to where the fire had once been built up. I tripped over a log and landed with a sickening crack. I had just broken my left arm. I screamed out, and all that came back was a deep, distorted laugh, as if 100 people had all laughed as echoes from in a cave. I then was on my feet in the little clearing I had set up. I was able to pinpoint where the sound had come from. Behind my tent, an impossibly tall figure with very long arms stood. It was completely bald, and it wasn't wearing any clothes, and had what looked like blood being washed slowly off its body by the rain. In its face, it was impossibly large, a smile from ear to ear, but it looked like it had never smiled in its life. A flash of lightning revealed its eyes, small, pitch black, with little hints of grayish lights for eyes that seemed to pierce into my soul. It lifted its hand in a sort of mock wave. I lifted up my gun and shot it in the chest. It stumbled a little, and what came out of its mouth will haunt me for the rest of my days. What came out was an ear-breaking shriek. It narrowed its eyes at me, and in the crying voice I had heard before, it said, "Run." I took its advice, running to my truck and trying the door. Locked. I had forgotten the keys in my car. Just as I had realized my mistake, I heard a slam on top of my truck, and looked up to meet its eyes. I could smell it now. It reeked of BO and rotten meat. Its breath smelled like it had just crawled onto a sewer and ate all of the stuff inside. It had grabbed my broken arm and yanked, not enough to rip it off, but just enough to feel like it had. I fell to my knees and took another shot at it, this time at its face. I had hit it in its beady eyes. This got it to release my arm, and its hands to go up to its face. The same ear-breaking scream came, and I took that as my opportunity to run back and grab my keys. As I left, I couldn't leave my bag that I had gotten so long ago, so I slung it onto my back, which might be the only reason I'm here to tell you the story today. As I had started to run back to my truck, it had pounced on me from behind. It had started to rip into my back. I stuck the gun into its foot. Its foot was just dangling by the tendon. It shrieked and jumped off, leaving me with just enough time to get up and run to the truck, slamming the key into the door and getting in. As I put the keys in the ignition, I was blindsided as it had rammed my truck, folding the passenger door in and shattering the glass. It stuck its face and arm in to finish me off, but a shot to its shoulder sent it pulling back. It got onto my roof. As I turned the truck over and sped off onto the dirt path, I heard metal being sheared as it had fallen off, and I sped off into the night toward the nearest town. I arrived into the nearest town just as the overwhelming pain in my arm and back had started to make me pass out. Luckily for me, a police officer had stopped me before I could get too far into the town. He walked up as I was slumped into my seat, unconscious. When I woke up, it had been a full 2 days since the attack. Apparently you exhaust all of your energy when you're fighting for your life. They told me I was attacked by a bear, and no matter what I told them, they had simply insisted it was a bear. Later they told me I had broken my arm, had deep cuts on my back, 5 broken ribs, and the onset of hypothermia, and a fractured skull. Apparently my head hit the windowsill when it had smashed my truck. Truth be told, I was very lucky to be alive. Now when I tell you I will never go camping again, just believe it, because something lives out in those woods, and guns won't kill it. They all died on the dead mountain. What an odd way to start a journal entry. Then again, it's kinda cool. They all died on a dead mountain. That really comes off like the beginning of some western, where the lead character is some grizzled old cowboy who talks about his kill count. That's sick. I'm not writing this for the sake of my own gratification, obviously. Doc said that letting out all of my negative crap and putting it on paper is a good way to cope. I don't know. It kind of helps, but still kind of doesn't. That's why I rarely do it. Oh well. Anyway, back to why I'm even writing this whole thing down right now. They all died on the dead mountain. I would say we all did, but that would be a lie. I'm alive and David is alive too. I could say our souls died there, but that would be a lie as well. These have died way before. I met David back during my service. Turns out this Georgian hardman didn't live far away from me, and we apparently share the same love for nature exploration. I suppose our military experience is what ensured our survival. I digress. My story might sound like some crazy conspiracy theory, or some bullcrap tale to anyone who might read it, if ever, but it's not. I went to Dyatlov's Pass with 9 other people, and 8 of them are dead. Ironically, they died probably the same way the infamous expedition had died so many years before us. As far as I'm concerned, only one person died because of extraordinary circumstances, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure about that either. Something killed Andre, a creature, but I wouldn't call it a supernatural creature. It was probably some sort of bear species or something. I hope it was one of those. Yeah, I do have to mention something that might make a conspiracy theorist or the supernatural enthusiast drool all over themselves, however. Once we left Vizai, the last settlement before our destination, the atmosphere in the area felt kind of weird. It's like the air was kind of heavy and cold. Not the type of cold you get in cold weather, but as if everything was devoid of life. If I had to compare it to anything, it's like the aftermath of a battle on a battlefield. Everything is so cold and dead, and nothing feels exactly right. It's like you're on another plane of existence. Like, I don't even know how to put this. Now maybe it's just the northern climate that made me feel this way, but I don't really know. There was this one moment when we reached the foot of the Holotatchel during which everyone just kind of froze for a moment. We had this collective lapse in thought, and we just stopped, looked at each other with confused looks in our eyes. I remember saying that we all just must be still half asleep, since this was the early morning, and just like that, we just carried on with our trip. I don't recall experiencing that feeling ever again. Maybe we were just being collectively tired, or maybe not. I don't really know. For all I know, maybe this thing is just part of my imagination. I tend to get that from time to time. Not very pleasant to hear bombs going off, where there are none. Regardless, I went to Holotacho for the sake of an alpine hike. I wasn't there to explore the depths of Dyatlov's expedition. I couldn't care less about that. I was there to explore the nature of the Komi Republic. Going out in the middle of the winter was probably the bad part of that idea, now that I think about it. Our troop and Dyatlov's troop share a bunch of similarities. Both groups had climbed on top of the dead mountain, and couldn't really go anywhere else due to worsening weather conditions. Both groups probably experienced the same rare weather phenomena, and both groups ended up losing people to the dead mountain. It's named so in the Monsi language due to the lack of animal life on the mountain. Later translations of the name came to be Dead Men's Mountain, due to the incident with Dyatlov's expedition. I'm definitely rambling way too much here. Anyway, the trip was meant to be a 3-week expedition around the Stone Belt range of the Northern Komi Republic. It involved 10 people: Andre, Maxim, Victor, Alexander, Shura, Pasha, Vova, Elbert, Aslan, David, and me, Simeon. So the 10 of us reached the top of the Holotacho right before a bad snowstorm began, forcing us to camp on the slope of the mountain. We quickly set up the camp, and as it was getting late, opted to go to sleep knowing full well how hard it is going to be to make our way through all the excess snow. We were all pretty tired, so sleep came easily, but I was awoken by the sound of moaning winds coming outside sometime later. My sleep is pretty awful, I'll admit to that. I'm the lightest sleeper ever, probably. The moaning winds outside were so loud and violent, they sounded like exaggerated ghosts wailing from the cartoons. I tried going back to sleep, but the violent shifting of air outside of my tent made it virtually impossible for me to fall asleep, so I ended up tossing and turning in my sleeping bag. As time wore on, I felt myself getting visibly agitated by the weather and my inability to fall asleep. At one point, I started visualizing these cartoonish animated bed sheets, walking around my tent moaning and wailing, while creepily elated smiles were smeared on the lower part of their faces. My own thoughts made me shudder in discomfort. Little did I know, I was beginning to panic. Being used to this sort of feeling, I kept myself in check. I can't say the same for the other guys, however. As I was trying to calm my sprinting thoughts, I heard someone screaming inside the tent. I shot up and saw Vova jumping out of his sleeping bag, screaming for everyone to wake up. He was visibly shaken by something the rest of us couldn't see. His body was covered in a cold sweat, and he was shaking nervously. He started shaking everyone awake and whispering about, "Something's lurking outside." Tears were welling up in his eyes, but it wasn't fear. He was having a full-blown panic attack. When the guys were all awake enough to realize what was going on, they started showing signs of discomfort and anxiety as well. "Go back to bed, it's the wind," Dado shouted at the boys as he turned in his sleeping bag. "The wind? Nah, something is out there with us, Dado," Pasha retorted. "What is messing with us? The natives? There are no animals here. It's the wind." Dado answered again. "Bro, it can't be the wind." Victor, who was usually overconfident, stuttered. I began laughing. It hit me. My own anxiety and loopy thoughts were a result of the infrasound created by the winds outside. It was probably a Karman vortex street raging out there producing infrasound. It's this sort of vortex thing. I forgot the name. It produces infrasound that causes you to hallucinate and crap. "Yeah, listen to Sayoma. He knows his stuff," Dado blurted out in an agitated tone. "Just wear your goggles and plug your eyes to not feel the effects, and go back to sleep," he continued. "What if it's not that?" Andre sheepishly remarked. Dado shot up. "Belkin, this is not one of your videos, dude. There are no monsters in the real world. Cover your eyes and ears and go back to sleep." We didn't like this side of Andre. He was making YouTube videos considering various conspiracy theories, urban legends and the like. That was fine, if he only kept it to himself, but the guy began to believe in all that bullcrap, coupled with his whiny high-tone voice and the occasional smartass attitude. He wasn't the most well-liked guy in our group. Yeah, it's probably the ghost of Dyatlov's troop, trying to scare us into leaving their resting place. Dotto remarked sarcastically. I burst out laughing. No one else did. They were visibly terrified of something neither Davit nor I could see or comprehend for that matter. I could see in his demeanor that the wind was affecting him too, but he was used to hiding his internal storms just like me. He laid back down into his sleeping bag and remarked, "Don't tear the tent apart if you're gonna run away from the Manx outside, and try to find a heroic prince to save your princess. Okay?" We all fell silent after that, as Dotto laid down again. Nobody had spoken. We just sat there in silence as the winds outside moaned and groaned. All eyes were seemingly focused on me. They were widened with terror and bloodshot from the lack of sleep. I began feeling my skin crawl, as everyone's eyes were seemingly focused on me. I felt as if they were staring straight into my soul, like a pack of hungry animals, salivating at the prospect of pouncing on their helpless favorite prey animal. I felt my heartbeat rising, even more than before. Chills ran down my spine as my body simmered. A cold drop of sweat developed at the top of my head, and slowly made its way down my forehead, and then across my face, but I did not dare to move. I was fixated on the malicious stares directed at me. This awkward situation lasted about a second all in all, but in my panicked state, it felt like hours had passed. The faces of my mates began contorting and twisting into impossibly wide smiles, and vile expressions of what I can only describe as sadistic joy. Sadistic joy at the expense of my fear. I felt as if my heart was going to explode out of my ribcage, and paint the whole tent with my blood. The moment my ears were filled with some sort of unintelligible whispering, I knew something was wrong. I blinked, and my mates just sat there in front of me staring into space, consumed by anxious thoughts. I blinked again, and their eyes turned to me, producing a sickening crunching sound as their necks twisted and turned in my direction. Their faces were plastered with these disgusting clownish expressions of morbid delight as the whispering in my ears turned into muffled chanting. I blinked yet again, and they were back to their normal selves. I clenched my eyes shut as I began breathing deeply, trying to calm my rampaging nervous system. The infrasound was causing me to hallucinate. 4 breaths in, and I felt 2 frigid, bony claws land on my shoulders, sending shivers all over my back and arms. That's not real. It's just in your mind, I told myself. Thud. Something crashed, producing a loud thumping sound. One so loud it even drowned the moaning of the vortex outside. It was so loud, all of us were startled. The guys began getting up and talking about something. I didn't pay enough attention to notice what they were saying. I was focused on the storm raging inside of my mind. Everything outside sounded so meek and muffled. I could make out one of the guys saying, "It's just the snow," but I have no idea whom it was. By the time I felt I was calm enough to notice what was going on, most of the guys left the tent. I shook myself out of my self-imposed meditative trance to notice that the tent was mostly empty, with Dotto laying in his sleeping bag, his eyes and ears covered. He was already asleep. And Andre, who was making his way out of the tent. He was barely dressed. I got up from my sleeping bag as he was making his way out. "The hell are you going like that, man?" He didn't respond. "Andre!" I called out as I ran towards his tent's entrance. "Belkin, where are you going?" "Hey, dude, wait a minute." Nothing. He just ran outside without even turning back to me. For a moment, I thought I'm hallucinating all over again, so I went to Dotto and shook him awake. He removed his ear flaps and mumbled, "Sup?" "Dude, did they all just leave or am I losing my shit?" I croaked. He sat up, removing his goggles and wiping his eyes before looking around our shelter. "Crap," he mumbled to himself. The realization sank in. They all ran out. Most of them were poorly dressed. "Gotta get to them before they freeze to death," I said. Yeah. Davit was already ahead of me, putting on an extra layer of pants on top of his pajama trousers. We dressed up as quickly as we could and ran out of the tent, hoping to see any one of the guys before it was too late. Looking around frantically, we screamed the names of our mates, but no answer came. We started looking for some sort of a clue. Something. Some sort of a sign. Maybe even a human shadow. It took us almost 30 minutes to find footprints. We had followed the prints for a couple of 100 meters before they were completely covered by the heavy snowfall. Fucking hell. I angrily shouted out. Dotto was laughing his ass off at something. What? What's so funny now? Dyatlov's Pass. What a wretched place. Dotto, you're sick, man. You and me both, Sayoma. You and me both. He chuckled. That's when he stopped and pointed his finger up in the air. Did you notice that? He asked me. Shadow? Yeah. Something ran not far behind us, casting an oddly shaped shadow. We slowly turned around and started walking to our east. After a few minutes of walking, we were startled by some sort of whooping laughter. Something similar to a hyena, but not quite. The hell? I blurted out. David pressed his finger to his mouth, gesturing me to remain quiet, and then he pointed to the left. Following his finger, I saw Andre walking towards something that looked like a four-legged statue. I nodded, and we quietly made our way towards Andre. He was quite the distance away from us, but we knew we could at least reach him and get him back to the tent and tend to him before something goes wrong. 15 seconds after we started sprinting towards him, I could finally make out this thing he was walking towards. It wasn't a statue, it was a thing, some sort of animal. It looked like this emaciated bear thing, with a terribly long gray fur dangling from its skinny frame. It looked like it was part of the snowstorm. I tapped on David's shoulder and gestured him with my hands an F-bomb, referring to the sight in front of us. His eyes widened, and he began running towards Andre and the beast. I picked up my pace too. When we were a few yards behind Andre, we both shouted at the top of our lungs, while still maintaining a safe distance. Run! Run, Belkin! Run away! The beast stared at us before releasing a paralyzing screech that sounded like a mix between the calls, a red-tailed hawk, and the sounds emitted by a tire violently scraping against an asphalt. It was so loud that we both stopped and fell to our knees, because the thing wouldn't stop screeching. I felt like my brain was about to explode at any moment, if this thing wouldn't stop. As I sat there clutching at my ears, screaming in agony, I felt something hit me from behind. The force of the blow was so powerful, I felt myself fly a few feet into the air before landing roughly on the frozen ground below me. Everything was blurry for a few moments, once I hit the ground, and then I blacked out. I doubt I'd be sound enough to even write this if it weren't for the landing's impact on my head. What I've seen during these few short moments was probably worse than seeing a person getting blown up to bits, and I've seen that. Unfortunately, I did that to someone. When you're blown apart by a grenade, you don't get the displeasure of feeling pain. It's just way too quick. A nanosecond passes, and everything is over. You're dead. As much as I didn't like Belkin at points, the poor guy didn't have the pleasure of going out fast enough to not feel a single thing. While his death was fairly quick, he probably felt a moment or two of hellish pain. Anyway, in these few short moments, before I was out though, I've seen what happened to Andre. 4 of these animals ran up to him and tore him apart like a paper doll, spilling his blood and viscera all over the snow. His death was a quick one. They had torn him apart completely. Nobody survives that. Not to mention how one of these things grabbed him by the neck and tore his head off. He had probably died before he even got to feel most of the pain, and even the little that he did feel probably felt worse than anything I could handle. Just thinking about it makes me feel sick to my stomach. That's why I've never told anyone about that until now. You know, when you kill for the first time, you're so nervous and shaken and disgusted, and everything just kind of spins around you, and everything is so weird and confusing, and I can't even put that feeling into words. It's something like being thrown into super cold water, or going on the craziest roller coaster ever, but not in a good sense. It's just like everything you knew just goes to crap, and it's not a feeling you are going to feel ever again, because eventually, we humans, we get used to killing en masse if we need to. You feel like you're a changed person, like you see things in a different light, but that's a fleeting feeling. Eventually, everything becomes a routine. Yeah, things back home for people like me become different, but eventually, it's all the same. You're the same piece of organic waste, and you're the same person, with more shit on your plate. That's all. I'm rambling. I guess that's a coping mechanism. I guess remembering Belkin's death just like the first time I had to put a bullet into someone, and I don't like feeling that. Anyway, I was awoken by David sometime later, and we were all alone in the snow. No Andre, No monsters. No blood. Nothing. We didn't speak about what took him. We just avoided this conversation ever since. I gather that Dotto didn't try to fight these things away from Belkin. He knew he had no chance against them. I don't blame him, really. We looked around for the other guys for some time, and when the sun began rising and we hadn't found anyone, we made our way back to the camp, and from there, we got back to Vizai. A search party was organized once we've explained the incident to the locals. It included me and Dotto. We ended up finding the bodies of everyone. Took us a few weeks to get to Shura and Max, because they somehow ended up on the other side of the mountain, covered in the aftermath of a minor landslide. Everyone was found. Everyone but Andre. Turns out, Slesarenko's backpack was found 100 meters from where his body rested. No clue why he took it with him when they all ran out. But then again, he had a flashlight and about 1 million batteries in there. His journal was there too. He liked writing stuff down. It's shameful he had to go so early. The man had a brilliant mind. What a waste. I hate this. I hate this so much. We let one of the search party members keep his diary. Lovely lady she was, so why not? Said she'll spread our story for us. I'm digressing again. Dotto and I know exactly what happened to him. To Belkin, that is. My thoughts are all over the place. On my last night in Vizai, I took a hike in the town. I was just thinking about all that had happened, and how this could have been prevented, if only they listened. Or rather, if we tried to convince them a little harder to protect their sensory organs. Anyway, as I was walking around, snow began blowing again, and a burst of familiar laughter rolled in the distance, making me freeze in place. I turned slowly to the sound of the diabolical vocalizations and saw it. It was standing showered in the moonlight. This wretched beast stood in front of me and stared right into my core. I could barely make out its shape properly. The beast had a thin frame coated by a heavy gray fur coat, hanging from its emaciated body. Everything was pretty much covered by the coat, and if it weren't for the wind that blew apart the tense coating of the creature, I wouldn't be able to see its skeletal frame. After a few moments of staring at each other, a gust of wind finally blew the patch of fur covering the beast's head apart, revealing its disgusting, dolphin-like mug. Our eyes locked for but a second. Its white eyeballs stared at me unblinking, making me feel almost physically as it let out its laughing calls, and then the beast turned around and walked away, fading into the snow. A wave of discomfort washed all over me, making me shudder. That made me realize that perhaps it wasn't the wind on top of Halatacho that caused all of this. Maybe it was the fault of these things that live in Dyatlov's pass. Perhaps these are the minks that the Montsi myths speak of. But I do hope this is just some sort of crazy undiscovered bear species. I can't know for sure, but what I do know for certain is this was the reason at least one man died on the dead mountain. Did writing this down help me? Absolutely not. I still think I have a part in their deaths, and quite frankly, the memories made me feel sick. I'm gonna stop now before I blow up again. God damn this. God damn every single thing about this. I'm done with this sort of stuff.